Okay, here we go. The development of evolutionary theory. In other words, this concept of evolution and where it came from. Now, we've talked about, sort of generally speaking, what the concept of evolution is. Today we're just going to look at some of the people and some of the ideas that contributed to its development. And so we'll go through a couple of people, just some important names you should sort of be familiar with. First one is a French fellow by the name of Georges Louis Leclerc. That's an L. Leclerc. Leclerc. He was a fella living between 1707 and 1788. And essentially, he was one of the first people to challenge the idea that life was unchanging. Remember, we talked about that as being one of the fundamental things that spawned evolutionary thinking. That's a C there, CH. He challenged the idea that life is unchanging. Right around this time, people were beginning to notice, at least, there were people called naturalists, I guess you could call them, and they were people who went out into the world and studied nature. And they were beginning to notice all kinds of things. They were finding strange rocks with bones sort of embedded in them, like fossils. They were expanding their horizons because, don't forget, at this point in time, there was a lot of movement around the world. The Americas had been discovered several hundred years before. There was a lot of shipping. There were people that were being exposed to places far away from where they grew up. So you can imagine if you grew up in one spot and only saw the same things, you wouldn't think that there was anything changing. But if you suddenly began to travel the world, right? People in the Middle Ages seldom went maybe more than 100 miles, but now people traveled thousands of miles and saw so many different things, and they realized that it wasn't the same everywhere. And so the idea that life is unchanging was challenged by Leclerc, and this led other people to sort of think along the same lines. So that's really all I'll have to say about him. The next fella is another Georges Cuvier, Cuvier, another French guy too. A little bit later in life, 1769 to about 1832. That's when he lived. This fella was all about fossils. In fact, he's widely considered to be the father of paleontology. He basically developed paleontology. Paleontology, which is essentially the study of fossils. And the study of ancient life through fossils. And he noticed some very interesting things about fossils. He noticed that layers of rock in the earth are stratified. You probably learned this way back in grade 4. There are strata, or layers of rock. When we dig down deep into the ground, we go through different layers. There might be a layer of sandstone, then on top of a layer of granite or something or other. In particular, any place that is or once was underwater develops sediment, right? And you know, remember sedimentary rock from when you were in elementary school? Well, sedimentary rock forms layers. And so when he studied the layers of rocks and the fossils that he found in them, he found something interesting. And of course it makes sense, but you have to remember, the first people to think of something, that's the hard part. For us to think of it after and say, oh, that's easy, it's because we've already had people thinking about it. Excuse me. So what we have here is someone who's thinking about the layers of rock, and he discovered that the further apart you got from layer to layer, the more dissimilar the species were, the more different they were. More dissimilar species as you moved farther between layers. So essentially, the ones at the bottom were very different from the ones at the top, but the ones in, say, the top 2 layers would be more similar, which led him to believe that things were somehow changing, right? If things are very different up here in the top layer than they are in the bottom layer, well, then they must have changed. So again, the idea of change, and of course he had heard from Leclerc about the idea of changing things, and so he started to think about changing, and he was comparing it to what he saw in the fossil record. He also noticed something else, something kind of remarkable that people didn't really appreciate, and that is that some species disappeared. You have to remember that at this time, the only sort of knowledge, or I should even say that, the only sort of speculation that was made about the history of the world was on religious grounds. And so, people thought that there was a magic garden in the past, and somehow God or gods caused things into existence, and that's how it was. But some species disappeared in the fossil record. In other words, way down deep, there were some that were there that are no longer around. We call that a species going extinct, right? Extinctions. Well, up until then, no one even realized those animals ever existed. And it was weird. Why would animals go extinct? Why would there be things, what would happen? They didn't even know about dinosaurs back then. So extinctions were weird. How do you explain that? How do you explain a species that suddenly just stopped existing? And so he explained it with an idea that he called catastrophism. A catastrophe is a really bad thing, right? A big event that sort of doesn't bode well. So, a giant earthquake or an eruption of a volcano or something. And what he decided was that natural events must have occurred and killed off species. So some of these poor creatures that were alive, and they happened to live next to a volcano or something, it would blow up and kill them all. Now, what's interesting about this idea is that he assumed these were sort of like rapid, kind of almost unexplained events. Because up until this time, as I said, with only a religious background, they believed that the Earth was only 6,000 years old. And so he thought to himself, well, somewhere in that 6,000 years, there must have been some very rapidly occurring events that wiped off these poor species from the face of the Earth. Sudden geological events, right? Now, that was his thoughts, and that's how far he got. Further, the next fellow that comes along is a man named Charles Lyell. 1797 to about 1875, I think. Charles Lyell was sort of taking the ideas of catastrophism, and he said, no, wait a minute. This doesn't make sense. He said, there's no reason to believe that geological processes, let me respell that. My carrot's getting smaller because I keep sharpening it. I have to get a new carrot. Geological events move at the same rate through time. There's no reason to suspect that back in the past there were tons of volcanoes making things extinct and now there isn't. There was no reason to expect that geological events went any faster back then. Everything was evolving at the same time, or at least geologically, right? The processes of continental drift and all of these things. Now, of course, none of these concepts were fully developed back then, but they understood that there were some kind of, in a way, magical events. That's how they would have explained it, that caused these things to happen. And this guy said, I don't agree with you. I don't agree with you, Georges, because there's no reason to suspect that. It's a nice guess. But I think that geological events move at the same rate, which means in order to explain all of the extinctions that we've seen in all the layers of fossils, in all the layers of rock, Earth must be much older. And then must be much older. Well, this was controversial because the Bible said 6,000 years old. Right? Well, the Bible doesn't say that, but if you take the time to go back in the Bible and write down all the genealogies of who begat who and the sons and daughters of all the people, and you go back in time, you can sort of make a guess that around 6,000 years is how long it would take to get back to Adam. But 6,000 years old is not accurate. That's what he was saying. And you can imagine how this kind of caught people off guard. Like, what do you mean? Ever since we can remember, we've thought this. But don't forget, around this time, we were just beginning to realize that stories are not really good indicators of reality. We were, as a species, humans were beginning to realize that evidence and observation is far more important in determining what's going on around us than just stories. It's hard for us to believe that people just believed in stories, but they did because they had nothing else. We're lucky to be living in an age where so much science has been developed, and these things almost sound silly to us, but to them, these were very real things. Okay. And so his ideas were critically important because it challenged this fundamental concept, which allowed for a much longer time frame, which explained how all of these other things can happen. There was a name for this, since the other one was called catastrophism. He called his Uniformitarianism. Uniform meaning staying the same. And he doesn't mean the world stays the same. He means that what's the same, what's uniform here, is all of the geological processes. The geological events that are happening over time are happening at the same rate. And there's no reason to suspect that way back in time there was a whole bunch of crazy stuff going on and everything was going extinct. And so we find those dead fossils in the deep layers. But then today, they didn't see things going extinct. They didn't see anything happening that wiped out all of the cows or something, you know. So his idea was, no, geological processes are the same, and therefore the world is very, very old. Okay, along comes another fellow then, Jean-Baptiste Lamarque. We mentioned him already. Baptiste with an E, and Lamarque. 1744 to about 1829. You can see how these guys are all sort of contemporaries of each other, right? They're all sort of around the same time, working, sort of taking each other's ideas and bouncing them off of each other. Well, he observed something interesting, Lamarck. He observed that there seemed to be something called what we could call a line of descent. Not only were there old fossils down at the bottom of all the layers, or old life forms and newer life forms, but he realized that by looking at the similarities as the old ones moved from this layer to this layer and then to the next layer and then to the next layer, it almost seemed like there was a progression where a particular animal or plant down at the bottom somehow sort of morphed or changed into newer ones, or gave rise to. So by a line of descent, we mean like a genealogy. We mean like this animal was somehow ancestral to the animals up here in the top layer of the fossil record, the layers, geological layers. So there's like an ancestral forms, life forms that were actually ancestral to others. And that was a new idea, because again, remember, people thought that, a tiger has just always been a tiger. But now we can go back and see, hey, wait a minute, if you go back down this layer, you'll see as you get older, there are animals that are sort of like tigers, but a little bit different. And so this ancestral line of descent became an interesting sort of hypothesis. Okay, now he believed that species moved from primitive in the deepest layers, so like little bugs and little one-celled creatures, and at that time they probably wouldn't have had the ability to notice one-celled fossils, but they would have noticed fossils of little trilobites and things that are very primitive and insect-like. Species moved from primitive to more advanced. So, he would say that, look at us humans, we're at the top of the evolutionary scale, right? Because we're so awesome. We're far more advanced, he would have said, than, say, a honeybee or an ant. Now that's an important concept. We're going to find out later that this is not actually true, but it did sort of set the stage for a lot of what was to come. Okay? The other thing that he believed, and we talked about, this is where we talked about him. Remember we talked about the giraffe necks, and we said that if a giraffe stretched its neck, then its babies would all be born with longer necks, right? He had the idea that what you could inheritance of acquired characteristics. So what this essentially means, like the giraffe, here's what it means. Let's say I like to go out, in fact I do. Here's something weird about me. I like to run barefoot in the summer. I like to go barefoot. So at the end of the summer, I get calluses on my feet, and I can walk on rocks, no problem. My feet become extremely calloused. So what he would have suggested is that if my feet became extremely calloused, if I had babies, they should have been born with more calloused feet. Well, of course, I had 3 children. None of them have any callus on their feet, because that's not how it works. But that was his idea. He thought that if you acquired a characteristic somehow in life, if you stretched your neck, if you stretched your arms, if you did something that caused something to happen to you as an individual, then it would be passed on to your offspring. And of course, this is not the correct interpretation. We found out later that there's a better explanation, and this one doesn't make sense. Because if it did make sense, we would see it happen, and we don't. We don't see an animal that, well, if you work out, you want to get all ripped, and so you eat all kinds of protein, you go to the gym and you work out and you develop large muscles. That's an acquired characteristic. That doesn't mean when your babies are born, they're going to come out like little Incredible Hulks. They're going to come out the same as you did, puny and weak. And only if they choose to exercise like you did will they get the muscles. So muscle development isn't passed down because it's an acquired characteristic. We know now that the only thing that's passed down, the right way of looking at it, is the only thing that's passed down is genetic information through our genes. Right? Genetic information is passed down, not traits themselves, but the information for traits. Okay, so that was Lamarck. All right, along comes the most famous guy, Charles Darwin. And Charles Darwin was about 1889 to, 1809. I can't read my own writing. And again, I don't memorize these dates. I don't expect you to. This is just to give us some perspective when we're reading about this, when things were happening. So you don't have to know the births and deaths of all these guys. Just realize they all were in sort of the same time frame. Essentially the early 1700s to the middle to late 1800s. About 200 years worth of thought, sort of here, you know, when you look at the dates. So Charles Darwin, he was a naturalist, right, which was somebody who basically studied nature, a naturalist. And back in the day, don't forget, there were sailing ships all over. We still had not discovered great sections of the world. When I say we, I mean Europeans, of course, have not discovered great sections of the world. Obviously, the people who lived there had discovered them. So when we say that Columbus discovered North America, it's kind of silly, because there were already people living in North America who knew quite well that it existed. It just goes to show you the bias of history, right? But as far as the European body of knowledge, they had no idea that certain places even existed yet. And they had just recently, in just a few hundred years, discovered the Americas, and they were still sending voyages over to North and South America to map the coastline, examine the species, get to know the place. And so it was very common for every cruise or every ship or voyage to have a naturalist on board. They were appointed to be the person in charge of keeping track of all the species that were found and making naturalist observations. And so he boarded the famous ship, the HMS, which stands for Her Majesty's Ship, right? Because everything was royalty back then. So this was the, actually it might have been His Majesty's ship back then. I can't remember if it was Queen Victoria at that time. At any rate, it was a queen or a king, and it was called the Beagle, the HMS Beagle, famous boat that Darwin lived on. There's a good Trivial Pursuit answer for you. He worked on this ship for several years, because the voyage took a long time. And what they did is they traveled down the coast of South America. South America, here's the Yucatan Peninsula, here's Florida, here's the Baja Peninsula. Okay, so here's where we are in the world. And they would sail across and down around, and they would stop in occasionally, get some samples, find some animals, collect flowers. And one of the places, of course, that's most famous are the little set of islands sort of right off the coast of Ecuador, which is very close to the equator. They went over there and they sailed around there, and eventually sailed off and back around the world and back to Europe, past Australia and around Africa and home again. So while they were here, he was collecting all kinds of samples, and he was observing and noticing things. All right, so I should write down here the Galapagos Islands, because a lot of what he discovered was there. Galapagos Islands, very famous islands related to Darwin and his theory of evolution. I mean, he found lots of stuff other places too. As you can see, he was in all these areas, but the Galapagos is famous. Okay, what did Darwin discover? One thing he found was that the flora and fauna, that's a fancy word for flora is plants, right? And fauna is animals. So the flora and fauna, the plants and animals of different regions were different. Now, you might think, well, obviously, but not quite, because what he meant was he came from England, and in England they had rodents, they had mice, and he knew what they looked like, and he knew how they behaved. But when he got to South America, he found that they had rodents too, but their rodents were different. Why is a mouse in England not the same as a mouse in South America, he thought. I mean, maybe it has a different accent when it squeaks, but why would it look different? How would it get to be different? If you're going to be a mouse, you think a mouse is the same anywhere you go around the world. That's what they thought. Don't forget, they're coming from a creationist sort of view where the world was created as it was. So why would you create a mouse in England and then make a mouse in South America look all different and strange, right? Now, of course, we know the answer, because we'd say, well, because it's a different environment, sir, and you'd be right. But they didn't understand that just back then, just yet. So his question was, why is that happening? Why wouldn't mice be the same all around the world? Or why wouldn't a blue jay be a blue jay everywhere? Not the case. The second thing that he discovered is that some fossils, he was looking at fossils, some fossils resembled living animals a lot. So for an example, I'll give you an example. There's an animal fossil called a glyptodont. Glyptodont. It was 4 meters long and it weighed about 2 tons. And basically, it looks to us in pictures like a giant armadillo. But today we can find living armadillos, and he probably found some because they do live in the Central American region. The armadillo is about 1.5 meters long, weighs much less, right? And you know what they look like, right? They have a kind of a pointy nose and eyes, and they have this sort of strange armored like plate shell and a long tail, and the plate sort of forms like an armor all around it, right? Looks like a crazy scaly, it's almost like a cross between a mouse and a turtle. You can Google armadillos. Well, hey, what the heck, modern technology here. I can go and show you pictures of armadillos. Remember our coral snake? He's still there. Armadillo, well, let's go glyptodont. And whoops, let's see if we can't get a picture of a glyptodont images. Well, there it is. Now, if you look at that picture and then just kind of remember it, and I just change the search to armadillo, very close, but different enough to be a different species. So here's what Darwin's thinking. Why would you have 2 of these at the same time? I mean, you know, what is it, because whoever created the world got lazy and decided to make all the same kinds of animals? Like, it doesn't make sense that you would have an animal in the past that was very similar to this, and then suddenly that one died and this one just kept living. What instead he was beginning to think is, what if somehow these 2 animals are related to each other? What if that glyptodont was the only one alive at the time? And what if that glyptodont slowly began to change over the many, many years? And today we have the armadillo, which is actually a descendant of the glyptodont. See, that's what he was beginning to put together to understand. Okay, so back to our armadillo here. And what's also interesting about these 2 animals is the fossils are found in the same region as the living organisms. Which makes sense, right? If these animals were ancestors to the armadillo, the glyptodont was the ancestor, it would have had to have lived in the same area. Okay, number 3, the third thing that Charles Darwin noticed, and this is another famous Charles Darwin fact: finches, which are birds, right? They're kinds of birds. Darwin's finches, they're called. They're essentially all the finches of the Galapagos Islands and South America. And he looked at these finches and he said that there were some weird things. First of all, he noticed that the coastal finches of South America resembled the Galapagos finches, which were far enough away on an island. So how did that work? How did the Galapagos finches come to look almost exactly like the South American finches when they were separated by a great vast ocean? The other thing he noticed about the finches is that there was a large diversity that feeding on different foods. Now this is interesting. So in England, there's a couple of different finches, right? So he's got a finch in England. They all sort of look the same. Finches in England essentially have a head and they have a thick beak. And this thick beak is very strong because what they do is they break open seeds and nuts. So they have a very thick beak, and they can easily snap open the shells of nuts. Now, in Britain, that's what all the finches are like. But he came across finches that had a long, narrow beak, which we only find in animals that tend to eat insects. He found finches that have a beak that was sort of strong when elongated, like a woodpecker beak. And this finch actually does peck wood like a woodpecker. He found that some of the finches had little tiny sharp beaks, which are perfect for catching insects. And when he started to look at all the different possibilities, he said, why so many? When places like England have basically just finches that eat one thing. And the reason, of course, he found out later, was that in England, this finch competes with many other birds. So there are a whole bunch of other birds that eat insects and eat the peck in the wood to find grubs and so on. And so the finches in England who were eating the seeds were very well adapted to seed eating with their beaks. But in the Galapagos, there are not that many species of birds because it's an island, right? So on an island, because you're isolated, it takes much longer for species to sort of migrate to the island. And so on the island, the finches were able to change. They were able to adapt to all the different food sources, and they all had very different beaks. It's almost like the woodpecker finch was taking the place of English woodpeckers, and the warbler finch was taking the place of insect-eating birds in England. And so what he noticed is that somehow, without the other birds there to compete, the finch was able to sort of take over all these different diverse food sources and change. Okay. So all of this was sort of the reasoning and the observations that he had. And he and another fella by the name of Wallace, which we can get to a little bit later on, Alfred Russel Wallace was the other fella. He doesn't get much recognition, so I'm going to mention him. Alfred Russel Wallace. He was working with or alongside Darwin, not necessarily with him, but he was working on the same thing, and he was coming up with the same ideas. So the two of them were sort of working together, but Darwin gets all the credit for some reason. Nobody remembers poor Wallace. He just, for some reason, maybe wasn't as personable, I don't know. At any rate, here's what they came up with. They came up with the idea that there was some sort of changing happened. Now, what's interesting is Darwin never used the word evolution. He didn't like the word evolution because it implied it implied that things were always getting better. It means to progress towards perfection. But what he noticed was that there's no perfection. In fact, perfect depends on where you live, and we talked about this in our previous videos. You're only perfect if your environment is well suited to you and vice versa, right? So a bird with wings is well suited to the air, but put it in the water and it has a problem. And so there's really no such thing as perfection. It all depends on the environment. And so instead, he preferred to use the term descent with modification. In other words, animals, the descent part means that animals give rise to other animals, like in a genealogical family tree. And as they do, over time, there is some kind of modification or change that happens to them. But that modification is kind of random, and it's related to the environment. So he called his theory descent with modification, not evolution. The two mean the same thing in today's world, because, well, actually they don't, and some people do still think this. They think that evolution means this, but unless you actually study what Darwin said, it's confusing. So he called it descent with modification, and He said, but the mechanism was natural selection, and we've already seen in our previous videos how that works and how it all comes down to the concept of survival of the fittest. But I will state one more time that fittest has a very special meaning. It means best adapted to a particular environment. And someone who is the fittest, if that environment changes, they can suddenly become the most useless. And we talked about the examples of how in Africa, the East African Rift Valley changed the environment, causing the species there to sort of be separated and to diverge and become human beings and chimps at the same time. Remember? Different environments. So best adapted to a particular environment. And why does that work? That works because if you are best adapted to your environment, you are the most likely to live long enough to produce viable offspring. Remember that? You can produce babies that can have their own babies and keep the chain going. And why is that important? Because viable offspring pass on the actual things that do move from generation to generation, and that is genes. Genetic information is passed on, and genes control traits. So you see how it all fits together. So what I've written here is kind of a sort of a summary. The idea of descent with modification, which is based on all of the evidence we've talked about so far, or at least the ideas. We haven't really talked about all the evidence, but we get the idea. And then we have this concept of natural selection. So natural selection, as we said in the other videos, was nature's way of doing what artificial selection that humans were already doing. Darwin knew that. He knew we could breed dogs and make them look the way we wanted. So he came up with a natural way of it happening. And the mechanism for natural selection is survival of the fittest, which is based on the passing on of genes. Now, Darwin didn't know about genes. This came later. But how nice that the information we discovered about genetics blended perfectly with the information that Darwin was presenting in his descent with modification theory. Okay, we'll stop there and we'll take a break. And then in the next video, we'll look at, it'll be a shorter video, we'll look at some of the actual evidence of evolution that we have, including the stuff that Darwin came up with, but also ever since, all the other stuff that has been added on to this to make the theory even more and more and more accurate, more reliable.